Hello, Tanse, Atlanate, Ani, bonjour. Welcome back to Our Shared Politics. My name is Nova. I am a settler on Turtle Island. I created this podcast to really showcase socialism instead of pursuing the Red Scare blindly, which just in turn pushes people further apart. I wish to express acknowledgement that I am on Treaty 8 territory, home to the Titskane, Deneza, Nehiawak, Soto, and BC Métis. It is essential I recognize all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, both status and non-status, as the guardians of these lands. As a non-Indigenous person, I play a role as a treaty partner being represented by the government. My pronouns are she, her, but I also accept they, them, and I fall under the 2S LGBTQIA+ umbrella. I say these things at the top of every episode so that you are able to make your decision on how safe of a person I am. Last week, we went over the beginning of the KKK in Canada, which sparked with the silent film A Birth of a Nation's first showing in Toronto in September 1915. The Klan didn't fully pick up until into the 1920s, with American Kleagles crossing the border into Canada in order to open claverns and sell memberships. 1927 was the big year for the Klan in Canada, where they sold the most memberships and really infiltrated Canadian politics. By the time the Great Depression rolled around, most chumps who were susceptible to joining the Klan already had, and those who might have been persuaded didn't have the extra cash laying around for the initial membership fee, quarterly fees, or regalia fees. And then when Hitler took power in 1933, and Canadians first began getting information about the atrocities being planned, all three levels of the Canadian government began enacting anti-hate legislation as though suddenly realizing the power of allowing unchecked racism to run rampant through a country. Either way, that mostly saw the end of the Klan in Canada until the 1970s, when the next generation of racists were spawned with misplaced anger. So that's where we're going to pick up today. I didn't mention it last week because it was such a concentrated issue in that part of the book that when we were going over the history of the KKK in Canada as a whole, I didn't feel the need to include it in my whole timeline. However, this concentrated issue had time to sit and fester for around 4 decades, and from it the Klan was born again. This issue, or rather conspiracy, is British Israelism. British Israelism, according to Wikipedia, is the British nationalist, pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-historical, and pseudo-religious belief that the people of Great Britain are, quote, genetically, racially, and linguistically the direct descendants, unquote, of the 10 lost tribes of ancient Israel. This movement began many years prior to the American KKK even being formed after the Civil War, and was actually first adopted by philo-Semites, basically an anti-Semite. During the mid-1940s, this movement began to take on anti-Semitic undertones when Zionists began calling for independence of Palestine from British occupation, which was achieved with the creation of Israel in 1948. This already very controversial belief of British Israelism had to be twisted into something even worse, known as the Christian identity movement. Christian identity's core belief is that non-Caucasian people do not have souls and therefore cannot be saved. Now, for anyone who's Christian or knows anything about the Bible, this will bring some immediate questions to mind, such as, why are Jewish people the chosen ones then? Buckle in for the mental gymnastics they've gone through for this one. Jewish people today are, quote, unsemitic imposters, end quote, and are actually descended from Satan and Lilith. And the supposedly Israeli-derived Anglo-Saxons are actually the chosen ones. This belief was essential to anti-Semitic Christians, as they could now maintain their anti-Semitism and at the same time trust the Bible by interpreting the chosen Jewish people written about in the Bible to mean Anglo-Saxons. How convenient. Beginning in the 1970s, groups such as the Aryan Resistance Movement sprouted up and began collecting arms for the purported final struggle against the Jewish conspiracy. They were robbing banks and assassinating rivals, critics, and opponents. The government of the USA became known to these true believers as ZOG, Zionist Occupied Government. During all of this unrest, especially increased in the years after Brown v. Board of Education in the States, a young Louisiana racist named David Duke saw to the creation of the modern American KKK. Born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where 30 years earlier the Black Wall Street massacre had taken place, Duke attended Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, wearing a brown shirt and swastika armband, acquiring the nickname the Campus Nazi. And he ended up having to hire a security guard to protect him from fellow students. He abandoned the white robes for business suits, and rather than call for the eternal damnation of black people, he instead converted the narrative into defense of white rights. Oh my God. David Duke thought he could make racism respectable and set his sights on state politics. Okay, so back to Canada. In May 1972, a secret banquet was hosted by an anti-communist group known as the Western Guard, where the Toronto Sun reported that the Canadian KKK had made a reappearance. However, this seems like the reporter may have jumped the gun a bit, as there were simply a few individuals who were members of the American Klan. Regardless, however, the Klan, the Western Guard, and the National Socialist Alliance, which was a group of neo-Nazis, claimed to be in solidarity against the threat of the communist left. Overlapping membership was common amongst these groups. The leader of the Western Guard, Don Andrews, went on to run for mayor of Toronto later that same year, where his platform was based on three things. He was white, he was young, and he disliked all things black. He ended up coming in 5th place and garnered about 2% of the vote. That was the public face of the Western Guard. The other face was the violence and intimidation it brought to the city. Buildings and construction sites were vandalized with racist and anti-Semitic slogans. A Western Guard member went to jail for 2 months in 1972 for spraying noxious gas at a gay rights meeting, and another member became the first person in Canada charged in 1974 under the new hate propaganda provisions in the criminal code. Andrew's home soon became a meeting ground for the young racist or wannabe Nazis of Toronto, and one of the young men who found their way into the circle was James Alexander McWhirter, a Sunshine Boy. The Sunshine Boy label came from the Toronto Sun, a daily tabloid newspaper where they had a full-page photo feature of a woman wearing very little, whom they named the Sunshine Girl. This was starting in 1971. When accusations of sexism began springing up, the editors launched a Sunshine Boy feature as well. James Alexander McWhirter was one of these Sunshine Boys, and while there was no mention of his specific political views, he was posing beside a poster that had a photo of a black man with the words, quote, "He may be your equal, but he's not mine," end quote. Since the Sun was nothing more than a right-wing echo chamber, this fit directly in line with their views, and they published the photo as is. The cut line said James hoped to win a seat in Parliament one day. Instead, McWhirter would become nothing special. He served in the Canadian Forces Reserves, worked as a security guard, and then stole a typewriter and served a brief stint in jail. When he got out, he started a landscape business and was able to get, quote, a stake, end quote, in several houses where he aspired to become a low-level landlord. How fitting. In Toronto in 1980, McWhirter formally announced the return of the Ku Klux Klan to Canada, and the first official Klan office was in the living room of his house. When the neighbors realized who exactly lived next door, the reaction was immediate. A committee against racism organized street demonstrations outside the house where ugly confrontations took place. He eventually moved the office to an actual office building before later being evicted when the Jewish owners realized who their new tenants were. McWhirter told the Fredericton Daily Gleaner in December 1980, quote, "The time is ripe for a Klan return to New Brunswick. Right now, this country is falling apart. The Klan is an organization that wants to do something about that," end quote. Anti-French, anti-Catholic bigotry was no longer on the Klan agenda. The focus now was simply white supremacy. Quote, "We want to maintain the white race as the dominating force in this country. We should look after our own family," end quote. Who exactly was in the family wasn't always clear, but there was very little doubt but who was not in the family. The reborn Klan encountered a bizarre situation in Alberta. A transplanted maritimer born in PEI named Ivan Ross McPherson was then adopted and renamed Barry Dunsford and arrived in Calgary in 1965 at age 17. Now, I wasn't totally clear the way it was worded. Sounded like he might have been adopted at age 17 and had his name changed, or the family just moved when he was 17 to Calgary. I'm not 100% sure. At some point, he took on the Gaelic form of his original name, which makes me think he might have been adopted at 17, because why would you have a connection to your original name that much? I'm not sure. In 1974, he was convicted of the shooting death of a Mexican national who was renting a room in his parents' home. His mother testified he was on medication at the time, and McPherson Dunsford was fined $1,500 for criminal negligence and $500 for dangerous use of a firearm. No jail time was given. By 1980, he was the self-proclaimed head of his own Alberta Ku Klux Klan. Later, in 1988, 2 of his Klan members were arrested and convicted of the conspiracy to blow up the Calgary Jewish Center and kill a local Jewish real estate agent. At trial, it turned out that McPherson Dunsford had devised the plot himself in order to garner media attention and sell more memberships, and it was later uncovered that McPherson Dunsford himself was actually the one who tipped off the Calgary police as a way to win favor with the Jewish community as a plot to make money. In fact, by the time his followers were arrested, he'd already gone to local Jewish leaders claiming credit for solving the case and promising similar results in future cases of threat against the Jewish community for a price, of course. McPherson Dunsford later retreated to Edmonton in his old age, where he reverted the spelling of his name back to the English version and immersed himself in spirituality and indigenous medicine. What the actual fuck? I'm going to read a chapter from the book I mentioned last week, The Ku Klux Klan in Canada by Alan Bartley. This is a really great book. I'm currently borrowing it from my local library here, and it goes over the first 100 years, or I guess the only 100 years, of the Canadian Klan really well, without a ton of filler, so it's not like a super dense, boring read. So this is chapter 13, Island in the Sun. The dream was the creation of a Caribbean nation base where white supremacists could safely make a lot of money to pursue their racist dreams. It was a dream that drew in a clutch of characters with diverse motives, objectives, and degrees of commitment to the Ku Klux Klan. For James McWhirter and Wolfgang Droege, the dream took their focus off Canada and into the United States and the Caribbean. The dream was preposterous, but the spirit of the times made it seem plausible. The scheme was given the name Operation Red Dog. The dream originated with Mike Perdue, an aspiring con man leading a fantasy life as a successful international mercenary. He claimed a record of fighting communism in league with the United States Central Intelligence Agency, foreign despots, and anybody else who would pay him. It was a fantasy he cultivated assiduously in his contacts with a shady netherworld of racists, con men, rich men, and white supremacists. A mustachioed bodybuilder with a prematurely receding hairline, the 30-year-old Perdue was living in early 1979 in a tidy suburban house in Houston, Texas. He shared the antique-filled house with his longtime partner, Ron Cox, who owned a design drapery business. funny. When I first heard this, I thought Ron was maybe short for Veronica because, come on, this is like a Klan guy. Purdue boasted of his military career in the United States Marine Corps. The reality was a 7-week stint that ended with his discharge after the court learned that he was a house burglar in his off-duty hours. After his release from prison, he moved to Houston, where he worked in a psychiatric hospital. Purdue was in a gay relationship with Cox, a fact he sought to hide from his mercenary comrades. Purdue told his gun-toting anti-communist stories to anybody who would listen. He sought out a new listener in 1979 in the person of David Duke, former imperial wizard of the invisible empire of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Purdue told Duke about reading a U.S. News and World Report magazine story about leftist rebels seizing power on the eastern Caribbean island nation of Grenada in March 1979. Purdue somehow conceived the idea that Grenada would benefit from a mercenary force retaking power and returning the country to its ousted leaders. The United States government labeled the new Grenadian government communist, yet another domino in the relentless Soviet campaign to take over the world. First Cuba, now Grenada, went the message. Purdue instinctively thought this was his chance to make his mercenary dream a reality. He flew to San Diego to meet deposed Grenadian Prime Minister Eric Gary. He spun a tale of how a small group of armed men, his mercenaries, could seize power and return Grenada to Gary. The ex-prime minister was non-committal. Maybe yes, maybe no. So Purdue looked up David Duke. The imperial wizard would later take a step back from any affiliation with Purdue. Quote, "He came to one of my public meetings. That's how I met him," said Duke. "I don't know anything about him." But he wasn't unhelpful. Duke provided Purdue with names and phone numbers of people he thought might be interested, among them the name of Don Andrews in Toronto, leader of the Nationalist Party of Canada. Don Andrews, David Duke, Wolfgang Droege, and James McWhirter all knew each other, shared a similar white supremacist worldview, aspired to positions of power and leadership, and hoped to remake the world to fit their views. Why wouldn't Don Andrews take Mike Purdue's call in May 1979 on the basis of a referral from David Duke? Andrews was intrigued when Purdue spun his tale of mercenaries, a coup, and an island in the sun. Andrews went away and did some research and concluded that a proper coup can be mounted from Canada or the United States and needed an offshore base far from police, intelligence agencies, and prying eyes. One of his political pals proposed a solution. Arne Pauley ran in Andrews' anti-communist circles, but he was no hanger-on. He was a businessman, someone with a contact here, a contract here, someone who could a contract here, a contract there, someone who followed up leads with potential for profit. The Eastern Caribbean nation of Dominica offered such a lead. Pauley persuaded Andrews to invest in a Dominican company to roast, grind, and package Colombian coffee on the island. It was a good cover story. The island of 75,000 residents also had undeveloped timber tracts. Pauley was working with an Ottawa businessman to get access to Dominica's timber and sell the product into North America. Don Andrews thought this suggested an interesting opportunity too. A timber company operating on Dominica would also provide good cover to launch an invasion of Grenada just 400 kilometers away across the sea. Andrews threw himself into the Dominica project. He contacted a Belgian mercenary and dispatched him to the island to gather information on local conditions. He financed a reconnaissance trip there for Arne Pauley, too. By October 1979, Pauley was back from the Caribbean island and ready to move ahead. Pauley's report described Dominica as an island nation in crisis. A series of violent confrontations between mobs and the ruling government had led to a change in leadership in June 1979. A new government with a decidedly leftist tinge assumed power. Then, on August 29, Hurricane David struck. Much of the population was left homeless, 37 people had died, and the banana crop was destroyed. Nobody in Dominica cared much about the idea of setting up a timber company. They were too busy now trying to survive. This was all good news to Mike Purdue. Why take on the well-armed communists in Grenada when the next-door neighbor, Dominica, was practically prostrate and ripe for conquest? Why not shift the target? Instead of Grenada, Purdue proposed that the project work towards the takeover of the island of Dominica. The government had all the marks of heading down the same roads as Cuba and Grenada. A strike against Dominica would still meet the criteria of fighting communism while enriching Purdue and his mercenary associates. Mike Purdue's fixation on fighting communism in the Caribbean came during a period when the United States appeared ready to confront the Soviet Union. The 1980 U.S. elections saw Ronald Reagan elected to the White House. He took office in January 1981 on a wave of anti-communist rhetoric and assertions that the United States would no longer shy away from the conflict with the USSR. The appearance of Cubans building a runway on Grenada that the Reagan administration said could be used by Russian and Cuban aircraft raised tensions. Before long, the United States was supporting forces in Nicaragua and elsewhere in Central America that claimed to be fighting against incipient communist or socialist governments. The mood of the time suggested that an assault on Grenada would be welcomed by the United States government. Dominica was an afterthought. Purdue tapped a lawyer from Memphis for $10,000 in operational funds to be repaid as soon as Dominica was seized. Purdue and Arn Pauley flew off to Dominica for more reconnaissance. A quick survey of the steamy capital, Roseau, pointed to the obvious target of any takeover attempt. The Dominica Police Headquarters on the outskirts of Roseau was a compound of several buildings that sheltered the island's emergency communication system, investigative service, and barracks. Whoever controlled the police compound controlled Dominica. It would be the primary objective for any invasion force. Purdue and Pauley walked around, took pictures, drank rum, and argued about next steps. Pauley was beginning to think Purdue was gay, which was making him uneasy. There was a big quarrel over expense money. After he got home to Toronto, Pauley made a quick exit from the plot. During this time, in the autumn of 1979, Wolfgang Droege was bouncing between his work with the Klan, the legitimate print shop job in Victoria, working in Louisiana on David Duke's campaign to win a seat in the state Senate, and regular trips to Toronto to meet up with James McWhirter. The pair were chafing under Don Andrews' imperious leadership style as head of the Nationalist Party and preparing to launch a revived Ku Klux Klan of Canada. Droege and McWhirter still recognized Andrews' position as a senior leader in extreme right-wing Canadian political circles. So did Mike Purdue, who had more pressing reasons to cozy up to Andrews. Until that fall of 1979, they had only ever talked on the phone. Purdue felt his operational thinking needed a face-to-face discussion with Andrews. The Texan flew into Toronto for a meeting. Wolfgang Droege was also in town. Accounts would later differ over who introduced who to whom. In one account, Droege was introduced to Mike Purdue by Don Andrews at his house in East End, Toronto. In another, it was David Duke who introduced Droege to Purdue, probably in the midst of Duke's Senate campaign in Louisiana. Regardless, they became great pals. The American explained his plans to take over an island in the Caribbean, with Dominica the prime target. It all sounded good to Droege, who had no long-term career prospects in Victoria, no close family, and no role beyond playing second fiddle to James McWhirter in a revived Ku Klux Klan. He was bored with life, Don Andrews later told journalist Stuart Bell. He just wanted excitement. He was just another guy hanging around, looking for adventure. Purdue wanted Droege to find Patrick John, the recently ousted Prime Minister of Dominica, and persuade him to hire his crew of mercenaries to restore him to power, all for future considerations. Droege agreed and left for Dominica in December 1979. Wolfgang Droege wasn't the only chancer scoping out Dominica. As he made his way across the island, he met two Americans from Las Vegas who were assessing the prospects for business opportunities. Carlton Van Gorder was in the gaming industry back home in Nevada, with interests in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. He wanted to open a casino on the island, but couldn't get any traction with locals. Droege suggested a change of government might open the door. Gorder wasn't interested in a coup d'etat, but he invited Droege to Las Vegas to talk with others who might be. Droege began putting together a plan. Casinos, lumber, tourism. All the elements to make a fortune were potentially available in Dominica if the conditions were created to make it happen. The potential was there to make a lot of money for white supremacist causes and get rich in the process. Droege flew off to New Orleans to explain his vision to David Duke, who said he wanted no part of it. He flew on to Houston to tell Mike Purdue about the Americans who wanted to launch a casino. If Purdue and Droege were to carry through on their plans, they needed seed money. This led them to Las Vegas. Indeed, the odds against the takeover of Dominica, as as envisioned by Mike Perdue were astronomical. The whole project flew in the face of common sense. How was a gang of white supremacists going to run the government of an overwhelmingly black population? Answer: they would work behind the scenes, propping up a revolutionary council led by officers from the Dominica Defense Force. How would profits from the various enterprises proposed by the plotters be moved off the island to support white supremacist activities? Answer: corporations controlled by the conspirators would launder the money and shift it out of the country. Mike Perdue hinted throughout the planning and search for investors that the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency and State Department were aware of and supported the proposed operation. In fact, the U.S. government was far more concerned with the Cubans and Russians operating in nearby Grenada, a fact demonstrated by the American invasion of the island in October 1983. Why would the American government support the establishment of a regime in Dominica that promised to be more unstable than not, while becoming a source of criminality and domestic disturbance for the United States and its allies? Why would the U.S. government want the headaches of Dominica when they saw the real problem elsewhere? Mike Perdue's hints of American government support were a fiction peddled to the unwary. Don Andrews later said he was in the dark about what was happening. He bought a plane ticket to Dominica in early 1980 to check the situation out for himself. It also gave him a chance to catch up with the coffee company where he had a financial stake. Like Drogue, he found the island a destination of interest for other entrepreneurs. Sitting in a hotel bar, he met two California men who were working on a deal to sell Dominican passports to Iranians fleeing from the Ayatollah 1979 Islamic Revolution. The price of a Dominican passport was $50,000 US. The plan went further. It envisioned setting up a development on the island's north shore to house wealthy Iranians in exile. Andrews later said he suffered a fit of moral conscience at the duplicity and blatant exploitation of the passport plan. He tipped off the opposition party in the Dominican Parliament about the passport scheme. The opposition was led by Eugenia Charles, a former student at the University of Toronto and heiress to one of the island's richest families. Charles raised the matter in Parliament to a chorus of public outrage. Safely back in Toronto, Don Andrews talked about how much he had liked Dominica and Dominicans. He later said he took no further part in Mike Perdue or Wolfgang Drogue's bizarre scheme and knew nothing about what happened next. Drogue and Perdue landed in Las Vegas in late December 1979, looking for investors for a scheme to take over Dominica. They painted a picture for future profits, underpinned by criminality. Lumber, casinos, brothels, real estate developments for the tourism industry, legitimate passports for a price, money laundering, and guns were all on the table. They were a little on the shady side, recalled Carlton Van Gorder, who showed the pair around town, introducing them to people. I mean, anyone who talks about toppling a government, they aren't the type of people you go into business with. Drogue and Perdue left Las Vegas empty-handed, only to return in January 1980. A pledge of $25,000 from a guy named Dick failed to materialize. They hung around for weeks looking for investors, but finally gave up and left. Drogue had other interests. He needed to earn some legitimate money. He returned to his day job in Victoria for a few months before joining McWhirter in Toronto in June to launch the new Klan office. While James McWhirter busied himself promoting the new Klan over the summer of 1980, Wolfgang Drogue resumed his contact with Perdue on the Dominica project. This guy's really just burning the candle at both ends. In August 1980, Wolfgang Drogue traveled to North Carolina to network with other white supremacists, scout for potential recruits for the Dominica mission, and shoot guns. He couldn't shoot worth shit, according to Bob Pritchard, a Vietnam veteran suffering from severe PTSD. Mad Merc Pritchard, as he was known in the mercenary and white supremacist circles, had trained at a paramilitary camp run by a Klan group out of North Carolina. Drogue eventually signed him up for what was now being called Operation Red Dog. In Pritchard's eyes, Drogue gained credibility as he diligently blasted away at targets in the North Carolina countryside. His marksmanship slowly improved. Mike Perdue came to visit Drogue in Toronto in October 1980. Drogue took the opportunity to introduce the American to James McWhirter, who had apparently been left out of the scheme until then. Perdue spun his tale of Dominica as a potential headquarters for an international criminal organization. McWhirter, of course, was intrigued. He agreed to serve as a communications link between Drogue and Perdue as the two operators pursued their plans separately around North America, and the Caribbean. Meanwhile, Mike Perdue scrounged for money, getting much of his funding from L.E. Matthews, a Mississippi electrical contractor and former imperial wizard in the State Klan. He also went to Dominica and finally struck a deal with Patrick John, the former prime minister, to return him to power by force. Then he went back to the States to line up more investors in Mississippi, Nevada, wherever the leads would take him. The plan was coming together. Droege and Perdue hunkered down in Houston and New Orleans in early winter 1981 to work out the operational details of the attack on Dominica. They needed boats to transport a small group of mercenaries thousands of kilometers by sea from New Orleans to the offshore of the island and from there onto the beach. They needed weapons suitable for seizing the Dominica Police Headquarters, and they needed about a dozen people with military skills to actually do the job. Perdue began seeking mercenaries through publications with the right readership, publications like Le Mercenaire, out of Aurora, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. His advertisement sought persons of disciplined character for security duty for a private employer on a Caribbean island. Droege knew people across the North American right-wing community thanks to his contacts with Don Andrews, David Duke, and Ku Klux Klan organizations in both the U.S. and Canada. These contacts offered up several recruits, all with more or less, mostly less, military experience, but almost all with Klan backgrounds. Among them was Don Black, David Duke's associate and Klan member with former service in the United States Army Reserves and hard anti-communist views. When David Duke left the Klan in the summer of 1979 to form a new organization, the National Association of the Advancement of White People, Black took over the Klan organization. I was in an adventurous mood, and I also needed the money, he later said. Black was able to interest a couple of his friends in joining the operation. Meanwhile, back in Dominica, Eugenia Charles was elected the new prime minister. She began talking publicly in March 1981 about threats to the island's security and threats reported to her by the National Police Force. The country's leading newspaper blared out the story that a group led by an American named Mike Perdue from Texas was gathering arms and men to launch a coup against the government. Eugenia Charles went on radio and laid out the plan in startling detail. Based on documents the government had seized, showing collaborations between Perdue and senior members of the Dominica Defense Force. Those officers were arrested, removing the leadership figures of Mike Perdue's proposed Revolutionary Council. The Dominican Defense Force was dissolved. Mike Perdue thought the game was up. Droege, not so much. He proposed to send someone he knew to Dominica to check out the situation. Perdue agreed. Droege asked a Toronto acquaintance named Marion McGuire, originally from Northern Ireland, to do the job. McGuire lived in one of Don Andrews' rooming houses and knew James McWhirter, who had already told her of Operation Red Dog. Mike Perdue came to Toronto to brief her, give her the money, and send her on her way. He also gave McWhirter money to travel to Dominica to organize local transportation for the invading force. Mike Perdue chartered a ship to carry his team from New Orleans to Dominica. Mike Howell, the captain, called the United States Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, as soon as the Texan left his vessel after making the deal. The result was an extensive law enforcement operation led by the ATF office in New Orleans to verify what was going on. Captain Mike Howell became an ATF confidential source, including wearing microphones for clandestine taping of discussions with Perdue. Mike Perdue was soon under close surveillance. An ATF undercover operative with experience investigating the Ku Klux Klan joined Howell's crew. Law enforcement agencies in Canada and the United States began building a profile on the conspirators during the spring of '81. The ATF started planning how, when, and where to arrest the Red Dog assault team. It was a wonder the scheme was still in motion, given the number of people who knew what was planned. Prime Minister Eugenia Charles and the population of Dominica were in on the story by early April 1981. Klan circles in Canada and the United States knew something was up. James McWhirter had already told Marion McGuire. He'd also already briefed Gordon Civil, a former media contact in Hamilton who was now a reporter for Toronto radio station CFTR. Civil in turn had tipped off the Ontario Provincial Police. A biker-turned-police informant named Cecil Kirby told his RCMP handler that Charles Yanover had offered him a job in a South American coup. It later turned out that Arn Poley was also a police informant and a stringer for CFTR. Mike Perdue and Wolfgang Droege seemed to be the only people who thought the plan was still secret and viable. Mike Perdue came to Toronto for the final planning session for Operation Red Dog in mid-April 1981. Wolfgang Droege was there. James McWhirter was there. Gordon Civil was there to tape interviews and take notes for a future documentary he was planning on the operation. Larry Jacklin from Listowel, Ontario was there, a recruit brought in by Droege. His major asset was 6 months in the Canadian Armed Forces Reserves. He was a former Western Guard member or Klan recruiter, depending on the source, active in the Kitchener-Waterloo region under the alias Doug O'Hare. Charles Yanover was there, marveling that the group was still planning to go ahead. He left when he learned that the journalist Civil was in the room. The rest stayed to their eventual regret. The Red Dog team began assembling in Louisiana on April 26, 1981. The two Canadians were Wolfgang Droege and Larry Jacklin. James McWhirter had driven Droege and Jacklin to London, Ontario, where they had boarded a bus to the States. They gave him a white power salute in farewell. The Americans included Mike Perdue, Don Black, and Bob Pritchard, backed up by a collection of past and current Klansmen, military and law enforcement veterans, pledged to fight the good fight against communism. Two of Perdue's recruits didn't show up for the rendezvous. Robert Lisenby and Frank Camper were Vietnam veterans, vocal anti-communists, longtime paramilitary activists, and trainers of aspiring mercenaries. They were arrested in Miami 2 weeks before Red Dog was launched, their car stuffed with illegal guns and explosives. Rumor had it they were planning to bomb the consulate of the Dominican Republic in Miami, having confused that country with the island nation of Dominica. Oh my God. Regardless, they were in jail as the Red Dog team began to gather. Frank Camper, though, was soon released thanks to his status as an FBI human source. This was yet another security leak destined to help sink the Red Dog operation. Back in New Orleans, Perdue and Droege delivered $9,800 in cash to Mike Howell, who was accompanied by undercover ATF officers posing as his crew. His team was told to show up at nearby Fort Pike State Park at 10 p.m. the following night, Tuesday, April 27th. Guns, explosives, and equipment would go into one van. The team members would travel in a second van. They would drive to the harbor in Marina in St. Tammany Parish, load the ship, and put out to sea. The next day, the 10-man team did as instructed. They collected their equipment at a motel in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, rifles, pistols, ammo, explosives, dinghies, radios, and piled into a van and Mike Perdue's Impala for the 2-hour drive to New Orleans. They arrived at Fort Pike after dark, pulling into a near-empty parking lot surrounded by concealed federal agents and local police officers. Parked in the lot were 2 vans driven by ATF undercover officers. The gear for the Red Dog team was consolidated in one van, and the 10 mercenaries were separated from their weapons and climbed into the other van. All settled, the 2 vans moved slowly out of the parking lot onto the highway over a bridge and turned right into the harbor in Marina, where Howell's ship waited. John Osberg, the ATF agent driving the van with the 10 men inside, backed it towards the dock, parked, and got out. So did Mike Perdue. Osberg told the Red Dog leader he was under arrest. A spotlight shone brightly on the vehicle. Arrest teams swarmed the would-be mercenaries as they emerged from the van into federal custody. Operation Red Dog was at the end. "You are not going to Dominica," a federal agent bellowed over a bullhorn. "You are going to jail." The end of Operation Red Dog had major implications for the KKK in Canada, even if the enterprise was not a sanctioned Klan initiative. First and foremost, Wolfgang Droege, the deputy leader of the Canadian Klan, went to jail. After Mike Perdue pleaded guilty to a range of offenses, Droege followed suit. He was sentenced to 3 years in a U.S. federal prison. Larry Jacklin, the 20-year-old from Listowel, was sent to a program for young offenders. Don Black and the other Americans also went to jail for violating U.S. neutrality laws. To add insult to injury, a U.S. State Department official told the trial that the government of Eugenia Charles was deemed to be a strong ally of the United States with no hint of communist influence. Even that justification for an invasion was a fraud. Back in Canada, there were several candidates for criminal charges. Charles Yanover, Don Andrews, Arn Poley, Marion McGuire, and Gord Seville. In the end, only 2, James McWhirter and Charles Yanover, were convicted for their involvement in Operation Red Dog. Aaron Pauley did not come to public attention again until February 2015, when he perished in a farmhouse fire near Owen Sound, Ontario. Only in Dominica was his death noted in connection with the coup attempt 34 years prior. James Alexander McWhirter, Grand Wizard of the Canadian Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, was clearly a candidate for criminal charges, having talked openly with the media about his involvement in Red Dog. Dominica needs white order and white government, he had told reporters. He later explained that his absence from the invasion was a result of having been deported from the United States in January 1981 for his Klan activities. McWhirter was confident that he would not be charged. But he was. The evidence against him was clear, much of it coming out of his own mouth. If you have control of a country, you can make a lot of money, he had said in a taped interview during the Red Dog planning. Our purpose was to make a lot of money for white nationalist circles. McWhirter's decision to plead guilty for his involvement in Operation Red Dog signaled the end of any kind of effective leadership for the Ku Klux Klan of Canada. More legal problems were pending. The Grand Wizard was out driving his car in the fall of 1981 when he was ostensibly stopped by police for a routine check. In going through the vehicle, police found 2 ounces of a white powder believed to be cocaine and a restricted weapon. Some reports said police also found 5,000 pills of an unknown but probably illegal nature. When the police went to the Grand Wizard's house on Springhurst Avenue, the scene of demonstrations the year before, they encountered McWhirter's housemate and Klan security director Gary McFarlane. The Klansmen threatened officers with a loaded shotgun, apparently seeking to prove a boast once made to the Toronto Star that you never argue with a man with a gun. McFarlane claimed he had always carried a pistol and a blackjack. On this occasion, he ended up surrendering the shotgun, 2 unloaded rifles, a .38 caliber revolver, some cocaine, and more pills. Criminal charges ensued. Then it turned out the powder found in McWhirter's car wasn't cocaine, so the drug trafficking charge was dropped. Armin Sixna took the fall for the restricted weapon. In the months after the drug takedown on Springhurst Avenue, the Ontario Provincial Police began an investigation into the source of forged documents turning up across the province. Certified checks, birth certificates, Canadian passports. The suspects, James Alexander McWhirter, Gary McFarland, and Jean McGarry, all residents at the same house. McFarlane and his wife worked as licensed security guard dog handlers, despite Gary having killed a man followed by 7 years in a psychiatric institution. Gary also pulled shifts driving a sod delivery truck. The domestic arrangements on Springhurst Avenue extended to the Grand Wizard's transportation. McWhirter's car, a black Corvette, was registered in Jean McGarry's name. The trio's bogus paper enterprise, which McWhirter later admitted earned him more money than the Klan ever did, was based on a business model that required trust. This was a challenge given that Gary physically abused his wife. Jean suffered brain damage at his hands. Then Gary cut the throats of 2 dogs beloved by Grand Wizard McWhirter and left the bodies to rot in the bathroom. Gary was clearly a threat to the security of the lucrative forging operation, not to mention Klan activities, although his sanity was also in question here. Ontario Provincial Police Constable Gary MacDonald, oh my god, another Gary, was investigating the forgery operation. Working undercover, he became McWhirter's confidant, the man who listened carefully as the Grand Wizard poured out his problems during a business meeting in a room at a downtown Toronto Holiday Inn in early September 1982. For McWhirter, Gary McFarlane was definitely the problem. He's a pain in my ass until the day he dies, complained McWhirter. It was a view shared by Armin Sixna, McWhirter's acolyte in the Klan, former candidate for the position of Mayor of Toronto, and a devoted follower of the Grand Wizard. It would be useful, indeed necessary in their eyes, for McFarlane to simply disappear from the scene. Really? Inquired Constable MacDonald in his undercover persona. I might know a guy, said the constable. If that didn't work out, Armin Sixna said he would be prepared to do what needed to be done. As a demonstration of faith, Sixna put up the cash to pay a contract killer. Constable MacDonald came through with a suitable hitman, undercover OPP constable William Campbell. For a consideration of $2,000 in advance, cash, Campbell agreed he could take care of the McFarlane problem. Planning for the demise of the unaware McFarland proceeded over the course of the summer of 1982, much of it in front of hidden police video cameras in the Holiday Inn. In the midst of this activity, McWhirter announced he was leaving the Ku Klux Klan as a result of the charges connected to Operation Red Dog. He was scheduled to appear in court in September, so there was some urgency to be dealing with McFarland. His resignation from the Klan caused barely a ripple of attention in the midst of everything else happening in McWhirter's life. Planning for the hit on McFarland came to a head on August 14th when McWhirter, McGarry, McDonald, and Campbell met at the Springhurst Avenue house. McDonald brought around Campbell as a potential drug customer. After some discussion about price and product, O'Leary and McFarland agreed to leave with Campbell to go get some illicit Percodan, a controlled opioid used for pain relief. McFarland was suspicious of undercover OPP Constable Campbell, thinking he was a cop, but went nonetheless. Once he was away from the others, police officers told McFarland he was the target of a murder conspiracy and whisked him away to protective custody. Initially, McFarland was incredulous. Then the police showed him the video of McWhirter counting out the cash on a hotel room coffee table to the hitman. At this point, McFarland was convinced. To help further the operation, and in doing so take revenge on McWhirter, he gave police his belt buckle and a knife sheath. The undercover officers went back into a meeting with McWhirter and Gene McGarry. They pulled out the buckle and sheath and pronounced McFarland dead. McWhirter and McGarry broke out the beer to celebrate. The Grand Wizard was clearly elated at the outcome of the plan. He tried to maintain a respectful decorum in the face of sudden death, but couldn't resist. So did he? This is just out of curiosity. Did he struggle? He asked the bogus killer as they sipped their drinks. McWhirter and McGarry were arrested in the street outside of the Holiday Inn where the murder deal had been sealed. Police seized false documents that included certified checks in the amount of $134,000, Ontario birth certificates, and a Canadian passport. Armand Sixna, who wasn't even on the police radar, turned himself in a few days later and confessed to having been involved in the conspiracy. The sun was steadily setting on the former Sunshine Boy. When the trio came to trial in February 1983, they entered guilty pleas. The trial judge took a particularly dim view of the 24-year-old McWhirter. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison for the conspiracy to kill McFarland, 5 years concurrent for conspiracy to forge documents, and 2 years for the conspiracy to overthrow the government of Dominica. Your participation was criminal, the type of conduct that is abhorrent and cannot be tolerated anywhere in the world, said Judge Patrick Lessange. Charles Yanover also pleaded guilty and received a 6-month sentence for his involvement in Operation Red Dog, plus 2 more years for plotting to kill a North Korean as part of an unrelated international assassination conspiracy. Julian Schur later reported that the only known Klansman to attend the sentencing hearing was William Lau Richardson of the Klan Intelligence Agency. He spoke to McWhirter before the session began and slipped away after sentence was pronounced. Co-accused Armand Sixna got 6 years for the murder conspiracy. The court seemed to think Jean McGarry had suffered enough. She received a 3-year suspended sentence provided she continued treatments for serious mental and physical problems. James Alexander McWhirter disappeared into the Canadian prison system, eventually emerging to live in a Toronto halfway house in 1989. Gary McFarland, the former head of the Klan security force, came out of the affair characterized as a potential murder victim, wronged by his romantic partner Jean and his business partner McWhirter. McGarry even signed over to McFarland his interest or her interest in the house. It was misplaced empathy. Within months, McFarland had a new woman living with him at Springhurst, and in April 1983, they were both charged with murder in the beating death of Barbara Luigi Quintel. Police said he was a friend of McFarland, but had no apparent link to the Klan. His battered body was left in a parking lot of Charles Howitt Public School in the North Toronto suburb of Thornhill, kicked to death and then kicked to pieces after death. McFarland was later described in court documents as a very dangerous man with a serious psychiatric disorder and a psychopath. He would be dangerous to be at large. Gary Eugene McFarland was sentenced to life in prison in the spring of 1984. With his incarceration, the last major leadership figure of the revived Ku Klux Klan of Canada was removed from the streets. So, oh my God, that is quite a bit. I just couldn't believe that they actually tried to overthrow government and fully planned a total coup. Although, white men audacity, the fact that they thought that they were going to be able to fully fucking like pull off a coup with 10 men that were essentially completely unskilled, untrained, don't know how to fucking pull off a coup in the first place. They thought they did, but their audacity that they thought they could just go in there with like 10 of them and pull this off and just overtake the government of another country. And then the fact they only got 2 years. They only got 2 years. Or he at least only got 2 years for that. For trying to overthrow a foreign government. Wolfgang Droege settled back into life on the West Coast, taking over from Ann Farmer as national director of what little remained of national Ku Klux Klan activities after he'd been imprisoned. He passed his days at the racetrack trying to perfect a betting system he had devised while in prison. He went broke. Then he drove a cab. Then he started telling contacts he was thinking about taking over an island in the Caribbean, just not sure which one. When the Vancouver Police Department found out Droege was already driving a taxi, they denied his application for a cab license. This is why you need to give people longer than 2 years in prison for trying to overthrow a government. Because look at this, he gets out. Like that summary, he's like, oh hey, let's go overthrow a government. It was only 2 years. The Klan's Canadian rebirth in the 1980s saw the rise of regional groups and leaders, some skilled and organized, others inept or simply criminal. They followed a familiar pattern of factionalism and fractionalism, particularly after James McWhorter and Wolfgang Droege went to jail. Splinter groups in Montreal, Winnipeg, Calgary, and elsewhere presented themselves as the Ku Klux Klan, but they had no national reach and invariably took their legitimacy from some form of recognition by one of the many rival American Klan factions. Regional leaders like Ivan Ross McPherson in Dunsford in Alberta, Michel Larocque in Montreal, John Gilroy in Ontario, and Dave Cook, Ann Farmer, Dan Ray, and Brian Taylor in Vancouver became the regional faces of the Klan. These were the restrained racists. The unrestrained racists were the skinheads who pushed to the front of the Canadian white supremacist scene, impatient with organization and keen to kick somebody in the teeth. They included Bill Harkis, a small-town Manitoba bigot who shopped around for a place to put his racist ideas into practice. Born in 1971, Harkis came out of Stonewall, Manitoba, and went straight to Winnipeg, where he migrated into neo-Nazi skinhead activity via a series of religious conversions. When he was a child, his family belonged to the New Life Baptist Church. Young Bill then moved on to Satanism and finally Christian identity, the faith of choice for white supremacists in the latter part of the 20th century. The spiritual home of Christian identity, the Aryan Nation's headquarters in Hayden Lake, Idaho, was a convenient drive from the Canadian border. It was a destination for an increasing number of Canadian racists, including Klan members. The British Columbia Ku Klux Klan met with the Aryan Nation's congregation at Hayden Lake in October 1981. The names of those who attended from the West Coast were not publicly known, although James McWhorter and Wolfgang Droege were on the coast that month promoting the National Klan. Another joint meeting was held there in 1984 with about 20 Canadians in the crowd, including Terry Long of Alberta, Carney Nerland of Saskatchewan, and assorted racists and neo-fascists from north of the border. The gathering culminated with participants donning Ku Klux Klan robes and cheering the burning of a cross. Oh my God. Terry Long of Caroline, Alberta, emerged later that year as the Canadian leader of the Aryan Nations, with the stated intention of unveiling, quote, the Jewish nature of communism and the genocidal intent of the part of the Jew communists to destroy the white race, end quote. Long, 36 years old at the time, was born in Red Deer and brought up in California. He returned to Alberta when he was 20 and graduated in electrical engineering from the University of Alberta. In time, he ended up running a sawmill and turned to Christian identity as the faith best able to help him make sense of the world. He offered up his property outside Caroline, 100 kilometers southwest of Red Deer, as the Canadian equivalent of Richard Butler's compound in Idaho. Terry Long lived close to others with views similar to his own. The nearby town of Eckville had Jim Keekstra teaching Holocaust denial in the high school before and during these years. Keekstra was removed from his job in late 1982 in the midst of a national debate over hate-mongering. The dismissal sparked a wave of hate-related activities, including the distribution of Ku Klux Klan posters in Edmonton in May 1983. Terry Long was president of a group called the Christian Defense League, formed in 1983 to support Keegstra. Before that, he had been a member of the Provincial Conservative Party, then a founding member of the separatist Western Canada Concept Party. He was defeated as a WCCP candidate in the 1982 election. Terry Long expressed his faith and political views using a telephone hotline that played hate messages specifically targeting Jewish people. In July 1989, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered Long to shut down the telephone operation. He didn't take it well. In a free society, I deserve the right to discriminate against whomever I choose, and they have the right to discriminate against me, he said. The white man is now officially a second-class citizen in his own country. The view was shared widely in Canada's racist community. It's not our country. This is not. If you're white, if you're a white Canadian, this is not your country to take back. I think we should be second-class citizens. Get the fuck over yourself, man. I have to whisper that or I will literally scream it because I am so tired of these people. Okay. Back at Terry Long's Aryan Nations camp in Alberta, an increasingly motley crew of racist skinheads and Nazis began showing up at the gate in the late 1980s. They included Daniel Sims, an Edmonton skinhead who went on to maim retired Edmonton radio broadcaster Keith Rutherford. Matt McKay was another visitor, the Winnipeg-based member of the Canadian Army, and Bill Harkis's Manitoba Ku Klux Klan shared stories of beating up Indigenous people and gay people. By the late 1980s, it was clear that the members of the Aryan Nation and the Ku Klux Klan in Canada, at least Western Canada, were often the same people. Carney Nerland was a chubby 19-year-old from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, when he turned up at the July 1984 Aryan Nations World Congress in Hayden Lake, Idaho, along with Terry Long and other Canadians. Nerland was a high school dropout with a voracious curiosity about Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, a curiosity he later transferred to studying the writings of David Duke. This led him almost inevitably to the gates of the Aryan Nations compound. From there, he accepted an invitation to travel to Louisiana, where he worked for Carl Hand, leader of the neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Liberation Front. Carl Hand was a former organizer with David Duke's Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and a speaker at the 1984 Aryan Nations gathering at Hayden Lake. He was also an old associate of John Ross Taylor, the Toronto Nazi and Klansman. I've known him for some time, Taylor said in 1981 of his acquaintance with Hand. He's a fine man. He's standing up for the white race. With first-hand exposure to a culture of guns, Nazis, and street-level violence, Nerland returned to Prince Albert in the late 1980s. He was working as a vacuum cleaner salesman when he obtained a license to open a gun store. The Northern Pawn and Gun Shop on River Street West in Prince Albert became Nerland's shrine to Hitler and the Nazis. Photos of the Fuhrer adorn the walls, Nazis' flags draped to the floors. Nerland presented himself as leader of the Saskatchewan Ku Klux Klan, a group that seemed to have only a few members who showed up for the occasional cross-burning. Nerland was in regular contact with Terry Long, who anointed him in September 1989 as leader of the Aryan Nations in Saskatchewan. Together, they began planning a gathering of white supremacists for the summer of 1990 at Provost, Alberta, just west of the Alberta-Saskatchewan boundary on the road to Red Deer. The two-day Aryan Fest was held on the property of Welder Ray Bradley, a Christian identity believer. It was a spectacle rarely seen in Alberta since the 1930s. A who's who of Western Canadian white supremacists showed up in Provost on September 8, 1990. Terry Long hosted. Bill Harkis arrived in a black Lada with Carney Nerland at the wheel. Racist skinheads and assorted neo-Nazis strutted around the site. Carney Nerland, the gun dealer from Prince Albert, made a splash in sunglasses and a Nazi-styled uniform with a swastika armband. Photos showed him brandishing a large shotgun, scowling, criticizing demonstrators and the media. Guns were pointed and few discharged into the air. Journalists were assaulted. Death threats were uttered against the media, protesters, and anybody who looked challenging. A cross was burned at night, with Nerlens and Harkin representing the Ku Klux Klan in their traditional white robes and cone hoods. 4 months later, on Monday, January 28th, 1991, Carney Nerlens shot Leo Lachance to death in the snow outside his gun shop in Prince Albert. Lachance was a Cree fur trapper from the Whitefish Reserve northeast of Prince Albert. He was in town to sell furs. The circumstances of his death outside Nerlens' shop remained murky in spite of a trial, a commission of inquiry, and widespread speculation. The self-styled leader of the Saskatchewan Ku Klux Klan and duly appointed leader of the Aryan Nations in Saskatchewan was charged and pleaded guilty to manslaughter. How and why Nerlens shot Lachance was unclear. The Klansman was sentenced to 4 years in prison to be spent at Stony Mountain Penitentiary in Manitoba. Bill Harkis came to visit him on November 5th, 1991. He is one of the great Klansmen, Harkis told his traveling companion, an undercover Winnipeg police officer. He's a real man. He's given everything for the cause. He's a real hero. Carney Nerlens was also a real human source for law enforcement or intelligence service, nobody could say which. On the day of his release from Stony Mountain, an RCMP cruiser picked him up at the gate and whisked him away to a new life in the Witness Protection Program. Nice that he was literally able to shoot and kill a Cree fur trapper. But because he's willing to share information about the KKK and stuff, he gets a whole new life. Others suggested he was recruited by the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Who was he sharing information about? The KKK, the Aryan Nations in Canada and the U.S., the Brotherhood? Was he working for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, which was increasingly concerned about the threat from white supremacists? Where, when, and how he was recruited, by whom, and against whom, remains known only to authorities. Corporal Matt McKay moved in the same circles as Bill Harkis, and Terry Long. McKay was a member of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry Regiment posted to the Winnipeg garrison. His activities over the years raised serious and persistent questions about the presence of white supremacists in the Canadian military. McKay was a regular visitor to Terry Long's farm at Caroline, Alberta. He was there as early as October 1988 on leave from the barracks. Terry Long was really interested in Matt because Matt was a full-blown white supremacist, recalled a participant in those meetings at Caroline. And I guess Terry Long liked that because he's so big and can stomp people. McKay was at Long's compound in March 1990 when Long issued a veiled threat against Keith Rutherford, a retired Edmonton broadcaster. In the 1960s, while working for a radio station, Rutherford had exposed a Nazi war criminal living secretly in Manitoba. Daniel Sims was at the Caroline compound at the same time as McKay. Sims had status in the Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nations, Aryan Resistance Movement, and a handful of other white supremacist organizations in Canada, the United States, and Britain. The next month, Sims attacked Keith Rutherford in his Edmonton home and blinded him in one eye, a potent example of the violence that erupted out of Klan circles. Meanwhile, in September 1992, the Winnipeg Sun published a photo of Matt McKay dressed in full skinhead regalia giving a Sieg Heil Nazi salute. By then, McKay had transferred to Canadian Forces Base Petawawa in the Ottawa Valley as a corporal in the Canadian Airborne Regiment. He later told one reporter that he had left the Winnipeg racist scene in early 1991 when he realized the potential harm his activities could do to his military career. Not to other people, but to his military career. He told another reporter he abandoned racist activities in September 1990 when I woke up one day and saw what was going on and said, no way, I'm out. The claims were suspect based on later events, but nobody called him on it at the time. Military officials said they were powerless to act since McKay was apparently not involved in illegal activities. The Airborne Regiment deployed to Somalia in late 1992 as part of a United Nations peacekeeping mission. We talked about Corporal Matt McKay already. I don't know if I mentioned his name, but we've talked about the Somalia incident already. In my 4th episode, about Cold War Canada. Corporal Matt McKay went with his unit, even though Commanding Officer Brigadier General Ernie Beno was briefed on November 19th, 1992, that McKay was under investigation by military police for his alleged involvement in right-wing activities, and they still let him get deployed to Somalia. 4 Somalis died at the hands of airborne personnel during that mission, including a young Somali man, Shdain Abukar Aron. A commission of inquiry into the Somalia mission led to the disbanding of the regiment in 1995. Corporal McKay was a member of the Airborne Regiment's 2 Commando, which drew most of its members from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. In the early 1980s, before McKay's arrival in the unit, 2 Commando had adopted the Confederate battle flag as its unofficial insignia after a stint of training with U.S. Army airborne units at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The U.S. Army base was notorious during those years for the number of military personnel involved in outside paramilitary groups, including the Ku Klux Klan. Millions of dollars of weapons, explosives, and electronic equipment disappeared from the base's warehouses, only to reappear in the hands of white supremacists across the United States. In the years after their stay at Fort Bragg, 2 Commando acquired several members like McKay who were openly racist. The Commission of Inquiry revealed a unit where members talked of beating up N-words. When the unit arrived in Somalia, the soldiers used a variety of offensive terms for the locals. Pictures of Matt McKay, a Klansman and skinhead, patrolling the streets of the Somali town of Belet-Huin with an automatic weapon created an unsettling image. The Commission of Inquiry later determined that while being held in detention by the Airborne Regiment, Shdain Aron was tortured and beaten to death by Corporal Clayton Matchie. Midway through the attack, Matchie walked over to Matt McKay's tent, got a beer from him, and sat with another soldier to discuss the ways that Aron could be assaulted. Over the following hours, Matchie continued to torture and beat the young Somali until he died. A video shot by an unknown member of the regiment during the Somalia deployment featured Matt McKay sitting in the shade under an awning, smoking. When approached by the camera, "Corporal McKay, what do you think about the tour?" inquires the videographer. The corporal was forthcoming. "I think it sucks cock, man. We ain't killed enough N-words yet," he says, followed by laughter. The images were later shown on national television. When Matt McKay returned from Somalia, he was posted to Canadian Forces Bases Calgary. In 1995, he was involuntarily discharged from the Army. But if you'll remember, the Army tried not discharging them, and they had to go for an appeal. The following March, the ex-corporal was arrested by the Calgary Police Service Tactical Unit. McKay and 3 other men were charged with second-degree murder in the death of Gordon Cootie in Winnipeg in June 1991, months after McKay had claimed to have abandoned the racist skinhead scene. The 47-year-old former railway supervisor had been ambushed and beaten at 4:30 a.m. on a riverside walkway where gay men were known to cruise for partners. The beating was seen by many people from a nearby apartment building. This was bordering almost on a public event, said police spokesman. Witnesses said 4 young men dragged Cootie to the Assiniboine River and held his head underwater until he died. His body floated away. Police alleged that McKay and his 3 co-accused were members of a skinhead gang who went out hunting for homosexuals, a tactic used by racist skinheads in other cities. Beatings and robberies of gays were called fundraisers by the skinheads, court was later told. One of McKay's co-accused, James Lissick, was kicked out of the military about the same time he was. When the case came to trial in the summer of 1997, the court learned that the Crown's star witness in the case, Lori White, wasn't even in Winnipeg at the time of the killing. She was in Vancouver, where she cashed a welfare check the day of the murder. The Crown was left with no choice. The charges were stayed. Seems like some fucking cop was sure to let him off easy there. Didn't do their job to make sure that that witness was the right witness to be called on. So that's cool. Le Clan in Quebec in the 1990s was the most violent of all the different iterations over the years, and because the province was a French Catholic stronghold, the next easy scapegoat, again, was gay men. Montreal skinheads began organizing into a group called White Power Canada, which was described as a junior Ku Klux Klan club that would fight in the streets but not implicate any of the older members. Events would demonstrate how well the strategy worked. The same events seemed to show influence on the thinking of the Montreal Klan. Meanwhile, Eric Vachon's Clavern in Sherbrooke was increasingly active. By the spring of 1991, the group was bringing Klan literature across the American border and distributing it throughout the eastern townships and into the Montreal suburbs. One of the publications was The Klansman, which officials said contained passages that violated the hate propaganda provisions of the criminal code. The White Power Canada presence on Montreal streets led to large-scale brawls with minority and anti-racist youth. The violence escalated. On November 29, 1992, 4 skinheads from White Power Canada, the leader being 15 years old, beat a man to death in Montreal's Angrignon Park because they thought he was gay. Yves Lalonde, 51, was robbed and beaten to death with a bat and tree limbs. 2 weeks after Lalonde's killing, another man was beaten to death at a highway rest stop near Joliette, north of Montreal. The rest stop was reputed to be a meeting place for gay men. White Power Canada skinheads began patrolling the site as part of a Klan-inspired war on homosexuality. Danielle Lacombe, 37, a high school teacher, was beat on the head until he suffered a fatal aneurysm. 5 White Power Canada teens were charged with manslaughter, aggravated assault, and conspiracy to commit a criminal act. They eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The Montreal Police Service suffered from a reputation for brutality against gays themselves, a view cemented by the July 1990 raid on the so-called Sex Garage. The gay club near Old Montreal was surrounded by as many as 40 officers who removed their name tags and battered patrons with truncheons as they came out of the bar's only exit. It was the latest in a series of violent raids on gay clubs ranging from the late 1970s to the early 1990s. And that's a perfect example of how the KKK only really hates what's already hated in that region. Like, they're not going to hate Catholics and French people because they're in Quebec right now, right? And Quebec obviously has shown a hatred towards gay people, so the Klan is shifting, and instead they're just going to focus on gays. One of the more inexplicable eruptions by the Ku Klux Klan into the public eye, with a Quebec connection, occurred in January 1993 in Georgetown, Ontario, a small town northwest of Toronto. With no warning and no explanations, 7 Klan members appeared on downtown streets in full white robe regalia and hoods to hand out pamphlets. Why they came here, I have no idea. Absolutely none, local councillors said. The handouts in English and French complained about anti-white movies, gun control, and high taxes for the minority welfare. At least one of the cars they arrived in had Quebec license plates, suggesting this was some kind of field trip for the Quebec Klan, for reasons unknown. The police took names, ran license plates, and basically let them go about their business. Like any other group, they have the right to exercise their, if you will, beliefs, said Staff Sergeant of the Halton Regional Police. Local residents had a different view. Passerbys began pounding on one of the cars and ripped the white hood off one of the Klan members. The 7 Klansmen drove away without explanation soon after, leaving residents mystified. And that was basically the end of it for the actual KKK. Once the internet really starts to take off, that's where the KKK kind of turns. Like, the KKK itself is relatively outdated. Like, you won't find an actual Ku Klux Klan of Canada. I'm sure there probably isn't even one anymore. Like, there might be, but they're not doing the same thing they used to be because they've all gone online now. They've all realized that they can make all these bulletin boards and all of these forums and all these things, and they could just spread their hatred basically unchecked online. And anytime anyone has ever basically tried to combat it, well, that's against free speech, don't you know? So we can't do that. We just have to let them just do whatever the fuck they want, basically. If you know about stormfront.org, that was started by David Duke's best friend. David Duke's best friend, Don Black, He, first of all, he married David Duke's ex-wife. Like, David Duke and his wife split. Don Black got in there, married Chloe, turned her to Chloe Black, and then he and Chloe Black, Don Black and Chloe Black, started Stormfront.org, which is like one of the main white supremacist websites like ever. And so Stormfront is kind of like a dog whistle almost now, is things that have Stormfront in it. So this is what he had to say in 1998. We see the breakup coming in about 20 years, he told journalist David Abel in 1998. It's a natural progression of events, said Black. This timeline would put disintegration midway through the disastrous term of U.S. President Donald J. Trump. It was a timeline that gave observers something to think about as the United States struggled with the racist policies and pronouncements of the erratic New York real estate developer who was elected president in 2016. The ability to reach individuals was like a huge part of it, and the fact that you didn't have to actually go out into the world and meet anyone and like let your face be shown. You could be a coward. Of course, they loved that. There was a dedicated Stormfront Canada subsection where a Canadian visitor could sign up for an account with a username. So basically like stormfront.ca instead. And the site warned readers that not everybody on it was their friend. You are advised to be cautious and thoughtful both in anything you say on this forum and in anything you do in Canada. To make the point even clearer, the Stormfront Canada moderator, going by the name Leto Atreides II, reminded visitors of specific criminal code provisions, i.e. Section 318, advocating genocide, Section 319, public incitement of hatred and associated penalties, as well as human rights acts. Canada does not have freedom of speech, advised Leto. Canada is dominated by powerful, wealthy entities whom oppose the survival and liberty of the white race. Okay. Leto Atreides II was identified by academic Barbara Perry as the online persona of a notorious Edmonton racist named Keith Francis William Bill Noble, a member of several white supremacist groups, including the National Socialist Party of Canada, but not apparently the Ku Klux Klan. Originally from Fort St. John in British Columbia, which is literally the city I'm living in right now, Noble moved to Edmonton, where he was arrested in 2006 and charged with willful promotion of hatred on the basis of material posted on his personal website. He was sentenced to 4 months in jail, followed by 3 years of probation. And this remedy to online hate, being the Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, was like, So Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act was able to help shut down internet hate sites or bulletin boards. However, this remedy to online hate disappeared when the Conservative government of Stephen Harper accepted a private member's bill in 2013, sponsored by Alberta MP Brian Storseth. The bill killed Section 13 of the Act, removing the ability of individuals to seek redress against cyber hate. The amendment was defended by the Conservative Party and its supporters as removing an unnecessary limit on free speech. This measure left only cumbersome criminal code charges as a legal tool to stop hate propaganda. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms, with its enshrined fundamental freedoms and equality rights, continued to enjoy the same high level of public approval and support it had enjoyed from its earliest days in 1981. As in the civilian world, the Canadian military saw its members targeted by online white supremacist recruiters. The Canadian Forces Military Police Intelligence Unit noted in 2018 that racist and white supremacist groups were active users on the internet. Online communities provide a venue to share and expand their ideologies and allow connections with a potential for recruitment as well as lone actor activity. The military police reported, prominent social media platforms have played a role in the proliferation of certain hate groups and their ability to attract members. Canadian Forces members were as susceptible as civilians. For some groups, the attraction of the military stemmed from access to military training, which would prepare them to wage a race war. For others, it was the fellowship of other races in a protective atmosphere similar to Commando of the disbanded Canadian Airborne Regiment. There were ample cases to consider. A young soldier was disciplined in 2011 for posting comments on a racist website. The election of Donald Trump as president of the United States in November 2016 ignited a wave of white supremacists and racist activity. Hell, even when he was just running for president, I was in Abbotsford in the summer of 2016 at one of my friends' family reunions, and their family in Abbotsford got KKK pamphlets put into their little mailbox outside the door. And me and my friend, we were 19 at the time, we were shocked because we didn't realize that this was still a thing going on in 2016 at the time. Like, it felt so outdated to see a KKK pamphlet. And I don't remember what it was like even really about, but it wasn't like super hateful. Like, it wasn't talking about death to anybody in specific or anything like that. It was more like white rights. Like, we need to defend white people's rights and things like that. I don't get it. So, all in all, there's a whole bunch of racist online groups. There's La Moite, which is supposed to be, it means the wolf pack, I think, in French. That's like a Canadian one. There's a whole bunch, though. I mean, we saw it in the Charlottesville riot or rally, Unite the Right rally in 2017, where they all got together with their pitchforks and their stupid tiki torches, and they were literally all chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And, yeah, so there are still racist groups, obviously, around and everything, but they're all online. And they are not the KKK anymore. They're not the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan, essentially, is dead and gone. Some posts by visitors to Stormfront Canada in late 2019 were sometimes plaintive, sometimes ignorant, sometimes illiterate. User TMWTB28 was trying to find a KKK group here in Vancouver. All of the sites have been taken down. Any help would be great. Whereas Whitey responded that, "I don't think any such groups exist." On the East Coast, somebody asked if there were participants from Newfoundland. Big Patrick 710 replied, "It's all whites here, bye, everything's good." A general query about the whitest city in Canada generated a bunch of responses. Son of Europe summed up many of them. The Maritimes are still pretty white, except for Halifax. Charlottetown, Fredericton, St. John's, Newfoundland are good candidates. Anywhere near a First Nations reserved was deemed unacceptably tainted. Anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant rants are and were the norm. Canada was racist. Canada is racist. Canada will be racist until we colonizers can make true reconciliation for the actions of the past. Our rug is surely bumpy now with all the dust we've swept under it. As always, thank you for joining me today. I drop a new episode every Monday morning at midnight, so check back in next week to see what I'll be sharing with you then. So-called Canada is in a fentanyl and mental health crisis right now. Please consider picking up a free naloxone kit at your local pharmacy and do not use alone. For any Indigenous listeners out there, the Hope for Wellness Helpline offers immediate, culturally aware, and trauma-informed help to all Indigenous people across Canada. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in English and French to offer immediate support and crisis intervention. While there are supports in Cree, Ojibwe, and Inuktitut, those are not available 24/7, so you may need to call in to find out the next time that a language speaker will be available. Call the toll-free helpline at 1-855-242-3310 or connect to the online chat at www.hopeforwellness.ca. And there is also the Thunderbird Wellness app that provides access to Indigenous perspectives on health and wellness, including substance abuse and mental health. Now, not that Indigenous people can't use these next resources, but they do not advertise as culturally aware or trauma-informed. So, for everyone else, if you must use alone, please keep in mind that you can call 1-888-688-6677 to contact the National Overdose Response Services to access support while using and especially using alone. And there is the Brave, BRAVE app, with a use alone timer that connects a paramedic with your location if you don't respond. For mental health support, you can always contact 988 to get connected to a crisis responder. If you learned something new today, it'd be awesome if you'd click that button and follow along for next time. Or if you'd like to contact me with feedback, you can email me at oursharedpodcast@gmail.com. See you next time.